Campaigning in the UK's election is entering the final stretch. The opposition Labour Party has a 20-point lead in the polls. So, what would a Keir Starmer government mean for relations with Europe? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Taxation, immigration, hospital waiting times, all significant issues for British voters. Brexit has hardly figured in this campaign, and that's in stark contrast to the 2019 election. What, if anything, would really change between the UK and the EU under Labour leadership?
This is the Labour Party's manifesto launch, when the main election pledges are outlined. In his speech, Keir Starmer mentioned growth 16 times, the NHS 6 times, future 10 times, but Europe or Brexit 0. The party's main communication about the EU has been to say what it won't do. No single market, no customs union, no free movement of people, and no youth visas. That said, growth plans for the UK do involve Europe, especially as leaving the EU has cost as much as 5% of GDP by Goldman Sachs estimates.
We will forge a closer relationship with our nearest neighbours in the European Union to ease the burden of bureaucracy and red tape on British businesses, including a new veterinary agreement, an agreement on touring visas, and the mutual recognition of professional qualifications.
Since Brexit, many British businesses report increased trade costs, as well as shortages of skills and labour. Aligning regulation in specific areas should improve some of these issues. But is there appetite from Europe? The EU has a lot on its plate: the war in Ukraine, another war in Gaza, the fallout from European elections, and the green transition, among many others. A Labour government will aim to bring stability in the UK, but will that be enough to bring the EU back to the table?
Well, let's meet our guests. In Liverpool, Jonathan Tonge is Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool, and I'm delighted to say here with me in the studio is Adam Boulton, British journalist and broadcaster, and Claire Pearsall, former Special Advisor at the Home Office. John, I'll come to you first. Brexit has barely got a mention in weeks and weeks of campaigning across the UK. For our viewers around the world, just explain why it's not a talking point.
Well, that's right. Brexit is the term that dare not speak its name during this election. The contrast with the last general election in the UK couldn't be more different. Last time, Brexit dominated to the exclusion of almost everything else at the general election. This time, none of the parties want to touch it. It's barely mentioned in the manifestos. The EU doesn't rate a mention in the big party manifestos to any significant degree. Why? Well, from the Conservative point of view, they want to say that Brexit is done. Labour doesn't want to reopen the issue of the EU membership because it didn't do well for Labour, didn't play well for Labour at all in 2019. And people just want to put the whole thing behind us. You know, it's 8 years since the Brexit referendum vote now. It dominated parliamentary activity for years afterwards. It dominated the last election. People are sick of it and people have moved on.
But in all honesty, John, it's one of the most consequential things that have happened in British politics for decades and decades. And yet, as you correctly state, nobody's talking about it.
No one's talking about it because I think that people recognise, A, it's done, and B, that there isn't going to be a significant revision of the UK's relationship with the European Union in the short term. The Conservatives are, at this election, insofar as they've mentioned Brexit at all, have bragged about the number of trading relationships that they've struck with other countries. 73 new trade agreements they trumpet in their manifesto. So Brexit is in the rear-view mirror for the Conservatives. Labour, because they were so divided at the last election, are very, very wary of mentioning Brexit again. You've got to remember, how Labour was traumatised by their approach in 2019. They went into that election with the public unsure whether they were offering a better deal than the Conservatives or whether Labour was offering a second referendum on Brexit. So they don't want to revisit either. Even the Liberal Democrats, who are by far the most pro-European of the three main parties, the Liberal Democrats are not promising to rejoin the European Union. What they say is that they aspire to rejoining the European Union single market in due course. So the parties don't want to go there. The election is being fought on other issues, and the parties think there's no mileage in revisiting the relationship with the European Union, even though everyone knows it is of paramount importance, as you suggested in your question, Enda.
Claire, no mileage in it and no votes either.
No, I think that's quite right, is that the United Kingdom really has now moved on. I say that, but it's actually quite difficult because the things that are left unsolved are things like Northern Ireland and the trade agreements within that, and also some of the trade agreements going across with paperwork across to the EU. So there are difficulties. Nobody wants to actually deal with them because they're complicated, they're difficult, they are going to be expensive. So none of the main political parties want to look at those, especially when it comes to the problem with Northern Ireland and trade and frictionless borders, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that nobody wants to go there, nobody wants to touch it. It feels like very much an issue for the last election. If Labour go anywhere near the subject, they're accused of wanting to rejoin the European Union. If the Conservatives say anything other than we need a really hard Brexit, then they are called traitors because they haven't stuck to their word. And the Liberal Democrats coming right in the middle just want to rejoin the United Kingdom, to rejoin the EU. So nobody wants to be put in those boxes. I think also the debate in the United Kingdom has moved on to other things like cost of living, the NHS, education. So it's not quite in the front of everybody's minds as it was.
Adam, it's a toxic kind of phrase in the UK, isn't it, in politics now, Brexit?
I take a rather different view. I mean, I do think that Brexit or our relationship with the EU is still the rather smelly elephant in the room. I think it is behind all the parties' stance. I agree that neither of the main parties wants particularly to talk about it. I think in the Conservative case, it's because Brexit is basically identified as a policy the Conservatives delivered, and we know that 2/3 of voters think it's a bad idea. Also, as far as Labour's concerned, they're trying to appeal to people who voted for Brexit, so they don't want to remind them that they were, they participated in this mistake. That said, if you look at the manifestos, there is this sort of gradation where Labour, back on, I think it's page 112 in the manifesto, actually says, well, we're going to seek a closer relationship with Europe, but not move towards freedom of movement. Liberal Democrats go a bit further, and the Green Party does go further as well. And one of the things we're seeing in this election is that pro-Remain Conservatives are quite attracted by the Liberal Democrats, and that some pro-Remain Labour people are attracted to the Green Party. So I think it's a dynamic in the electorate, even if it's unspoken and by and large avoided by the party leaders.
John, I want to take a quick look at the polling, because if the polling is to be believed, Keir Starmer will be heading into number 10 Downing Street very, very shortly. So this is the poll of polls, latest general election voting intentions across the UK. Labour ahead with 43%. The current party in power, the Conservatives, way behind on 23%. Reform UK and the Green parties tie with 9%. And then you have the Liberal Democrats coming in on 8%. So if the polls are correct, Keir Starmer will win this general election. We'll wait and see if that happens. But what do you think he will approach Europe with? I mean, will he offer the hand of friendship and try and undo some of what a lot of people would say, John, is the damage of the last 14 years?
I think Keir Starmer will approach it with trepidation, because it's worth remembering that he was the shadow Brexit secretary for a number of years when in the run-up to that 2019 election. And if you look at Keir Starmer's speeches at the party conferences, and I was there a couple of them in Liverpool, it was Keir Starmer, above all else within the Labour Party, who was trying to go for the second referendum option. And in many ways, it was he that muddied the waters over what Labour's policy actually was. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn, when he was leader, was ever a big fan of the European Union. He was on that Lexit, as we called it, left-wing, exitier wing of the Labour Party, even though he denied voting for Brexit in 2016. So there's a school of thought still within the Labour Party that Keir Starmer was helped bring about Labour's downfall in 2019 by doing that. But moving on to today, and what Keir Starmer does, if you look at Labour's manifesto, it says Britain is confident in its status outside the European Union. And there's a categorical pledge that Labour will not seek to rejoin the European Union. All that said, Keir Starmer recognises that we need a better trading relationship with our European partners. He talks about moving closer to the European Union in terms of security arrangements. That's quite explicit in the manifesto. So that will be the starting point. That's not to supplant any relationship with NATO whatsoever, but it's an approach that sees a common European security policy as a useful aspect of European relations. It's after that you will probably see Keir Starmer try and align the UK that bit closer to the European Union. He said that the UK can get a better deal than the trade and cooperation agreement that Boris Johnson negotiated with the European Union. What we've not had from Labour is the specifics of that. In what aspects is the current arrangement defunct or unsuitable or unsatisfactory? And what aspects of the trade and cooperation agreement will Labour replace? That's where we're waiting for greater clarity, but that's simply not featured in the debate so far within this election.
Claire, a few months ago, Starmer went to Paris and he was welcomed with open arms. He got an audience with President Macron. They sat down. Is he the bridge builder that Britain has been crying out for?
I'm not so sure, really, because there's the question that 17.2 million people who voted for Brexit will see that as an ultimate betrayal. I think there is merit to having the conversations regarding trade, especially when you look at paperwork requirements at the border, veterinary requirements, especially for products going into Northern Ireland. Those are going to be really badly affected when the new paperwork rules come in, because bear in mind, they haven't actually started yet. They have been delayed so many times. I don't think necessarily bridge builder is what is needed. I think that also the EU takes the view that the United Kingdom has left. So it's not particularly in their interest to make too much effort. I think they will look as if they are trying, they will be cordial, but realistically, I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference. And the majority of people who voted for Brexit in this country will look at that and say that is Keir Starmer wanting a better, secure relationship with the EU, which essentially takes us one step closer to rejoining the EU bloc as a whole. So it's a really tricky one to navigate. And of course, the Conservative Party would put around the rhetoric that this is the first step and it will release more migrants into the United Kingdom, for example. Keir Starmer signing up to taking another 100,000. Now, these figures aren't correct in any way, shape or form, but you can see how that story is built from just that one meeting.
Adam.
Well, I don't think for any party rejoining is really on the agenda. I think it's accepted that it was a done deal and it won't go back. And I also think there's concern about the relationship with France because, of course, France is going to have a parliamentary election before we have our election, and we don't know, no idea really what, even though the president is in charge of foreign policy, what sort of government in Paris will be dealing with. That said, I think the Professor's absolutely right that Labour Party sees our contribution to European defence as one of our strong cards, most likely within a security pillar within NATO, which is something France has long resisted but seems to be moving towards. The new Prime Minister will be hosting a meeting of a European group within days of the British election. But Claire's absolutely right. I mean, a lot of this does come back to migration. Now, what we've heard from Keir Starmer is he believes that stopping the boats and stopping migration can be sorted out by better cooperation on security and enforcement with European partners. The Conservatives are saying, well, if you do that, you'll be going towards the EU migration plan, and that may mean that the UK has to take more migrants rather than less, because proportionally per head of the population, actually, we take considerably less than France or Germany. That is becoming an election row, although I don't think it'll get particularly focused. But there is this block to the Labour Party going any further, which is that if they were to say, we were going to go into the single market, then there would be freedom of movement. And if there's freedom of movement, it'll be said by their opponents that that would lead to hundreds of thousands of people coming into this country. Of course, the irony is that since Brexit ended freedom of movement, actually more people have come in from outside the European Union than were ever coming from within the European Union. So you can argue that one both ways. But I think it's certainly clear that in as much as they're taking for granted victory, which they're not, Labour is already thinking about relationship with Europe. And it looks as if that is largely going to be run out of the Cabinet Office, which is close to the Prime Minister, by Nick Thomas-Symonds, rather than from the Foreign Office, which is going to take a rather more global approach to foreign affairs and particularly managing the US presidency.
John, we've seen successive Conservative Prime Ministers all trying to stop the boats, the migration coming from the beaches of northern France. What do you think Starmer might do differently? Do you think he will try and have closer cooperation with the French? Because at one stage, Liz Truss was openly saying that President Macron, she was asked the question, was he a friend or foe? And she said, we'll see.
Yeah, good answer. I think that, well, the first thing is that Keir Starmer will, of course, scrap the Rwanda policy. That's one of the most unambiguous pledges that is there within Labour's programme. And the Rwanda policy has been a disaster. Rishi Sunak, if you're going to have a policy, remember, Conservative supporters are very strong on immigration. They want a hardline policy on immigration. They want the net migration to be reduced. What the Rwanda policy has done, though, is it actually draw attention to the fact, as Adam's pointed out, that the number of people actually entering our shores in net terms has increased over the last few years. The Rwanda policy hasn't worked. There hasn't been a single involuntary deportation to Rwanda. And so that'll be easy enough for Labour to get rid of it. It's also worth noting as well that most Labour supporters, if you look at the survey evidence, back the scrapping of the Rwanda policy. So that's an easy win for Keir Starmer. But to beef up what he promises it as its replacement will require greater cooperation, in particular with the French. Hence Keir Starmer's emphasis upon the need for greater cooperation in terms of European security, including border security. Keir Starmer has promised the arrival of what he rather grandly, I think, terms this new border command, which rather implies that the current authorities are not up to the job in terms of stopping the boats that way, that you have greater cooperation with France and other European countries, and in that sense you can help solve this problem. I don't think any of the parties can solve this problem. In one sense, the fact is the UK is an attractive country for all its flaws to come to, and the fact is that there will still be waves of migrants. Of course, all the parties are promising to get really, really tough in terms of sentencing of the gang leaders who encourage migrants to risk their lives coming across the channel. But it's political folly to pretend that there's any easy solution to this, as no doubt Keir Starmer will find, assuming that he is in office as Prime Minister come the 5th of July.
It should be said, Enda, that Rishi Sunak has now weaponised this. He said in the debate this week that people are queuing up in Calais waiting to cross if Keir Starmer is elected Prime Minister. Keir Starmer responded by saying that his experience as Britain's top prosecutor, Director of Public Prosecutions, he believes there is the possibility for much better enforcement with European justice systems on the movement of people.
Claire, I just want to talk about where Britain's relationship is with the EU right now and European neighbours. Would you say it's the lowest it's ever been for decades?
No, I don't. I think that it was lower in the intervening period after the Brexit election. I think 2019 was probably the peak of that, with Boris Johnson and his Get Brexit Done flag-waving kind of speeches. But I actually think it's probably in a slightly better place than it has been. I think that Europe itself is seeing a lot of political upheaval with the elections that are going on at the moment across the EU, and especially looking into the election in Paris, which is imminent. So I think that we have the same problems as parts of the EU, migration being the biggest one. And I actually think that everybody is now sort of going, OK, should we just calm this down? Because I think everyone realises that they are going to need to work together, because this is a global problem of migration. If you just look at migration solely on its own, it is a global problem. So it is not for each individual country to almost draw up the borders and say, this is what we're going to do. There needs to be a properly big, grown-up conversation to be had. And I think that is going to start to happen. It's not going to necessarily answer all the questions. I think Jonathan's quite right with that it's not easy, but there will be room to work together, to collaborate on some ideas that will stop what is essentially a trafficking trade across from Middle East, North Africa and across the Mediterranean into mainland Europe.
Adam, when people in Britain have the debate about migration, one politician gets an awful lot of airtime here. He's never been elected to Parliament. This is his 8th time of trying. Nigel Farage, where will he fit and sit in the whole debate of any future Parliament if he gets elected?
Well, it looks at the moment, if he is elected, that he'll be one of possibly a group of one, but only a handful of MPs from the Reform UK party. My personal view is that Nigel Farage's long-term ambition has always been to insinuate himself into the Conservative Party and to try and become a leader of the Conservative Party. That will depend on the balance of the parliamentary party between left and right after the election, and we can pretty much say that the mood of the membership who actually elect the leader is pretty far to the right, and most of them talk about Nigel and would quite happily see Nigel being in their party, if not the leader. So I think that is his game. I think the question is whether he has the energy and the application to see that through. I mean, he's a man who's used successive parties as a personal vehicle. And I've always felt, I mean, he started life as a member of the Conservative Party, and that is probably where he'd like to end up. I should just say on relation with Europe, I think the Europeans know Nigel Farage very well because, of course, he was a member of the European Parliament. They would see him as part of the far-right group, which we've seen in France and AfD in Germany and elsewhere. But they, too, are a little bit wary of him. And I think the point about our relationship with Europe is Rishi Sunak did try and rebuild relations, but he instinctively was never very interested in Europe. He didn't visit the German Chancellor for 18 months after becoming leader, didn't focus on it. It's quite clear that Labour will have to be more engaged with Europe. And in a sense, the D-Day celebration summarised that. That was about the defence of Europe. Keir Starmer actually tried to be there. Rishi Sunak had an invitation and pulled out. So I think that message has got across. And just one final point about Europe. The left in Europe, the centre-left, the socialists, will be absolutely delighted by a victory for Labour if it happens, simply because they're losing everywhere else and they want to look to a strong leader with a strong majority within Europe.
John, just talk to us about how important the relationship is for the UK in terms of growing and trade. Whoever is Prime Minister on July the 5th, whether Sunak pulls off a miracle and stays in power or Starmer comes in with a landslide, as all the polls are predicting, the relationship with Europe for the UK is still very, very important for trade.
Absolutely. I mean, Europe is obviously, by virtue of geography, our closest trading partner. There is no economic boom from Brexit. You can certainly make a case, of course, that the economy of the UK has performed on a comparable basis post-Brexit to those of France and Germany. But ultimately, we do need a strong trading relationship with the European Union. I think also, both main parties recognise that. The question is how you go about it. And looking at the trade and cooperation agreement, what is suboptimal about it that ought to be replaced that would further improve our relationship? We're certainly not going to get any goodies or freebies or handouts from the European Union. They don't want to revisit, in many ways, that trade and cooperation agreement. That's the problem that Keir Starmer has. He's trying to, if he's true to his word, unpick or revise, at least, something that the EU has put to bed. In terms of the previous questions, returning to that, and in terms of what Adam said, I completely agree in terms of Nigel Farage, by the way. It is his ambition to lead the Conservative right in a post-Sunak assuming that Rishi Sunak is not in place, in a post-Sunak era.
Claire, whatever happens, we're in for a very interesting time. There's going to be change in London, big change in France, and all these new kind of personalities coming into the mix.
Yeah, there are. And also, remember, later in the year, we have the US presidential election, which adds another dimension onto the debate that we're just talking about. So there is an awful lot at stake. I think that you can see the populist movements do come up and they are exciting people. Now, whether you agree with them or not, what it has done is it has shone a light on a sort of big party politics, and people are angry, especially people within the Conservative Party, which is why you see the rise of the likes of Nigel Farage and Reform UK. I always take great exception when somebody says that he will take over the Conservative Party.
I'm saying that's what he's after. I'm not saying he's
Yeah.
going to do it.
But there are a lot of people who suggest that it's a done deal. And I think that is incredibly unfair. He is an increasingly divisive character who has spent most of his time looking to destroy the Conservative Party.
And look after himself,
And
some
look
would
after
say.
himself.
Yeah.
And I think that his main ambition is to be the best Nigel Farage that he can be. He doesn't need a party around him.
No doubt we will talk much more about him and the future of Conservative politics. Claire, Adam and John, thank you all so much for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.